joining us, and thank you to our collaborative partners who have put the series together over the summer. Again, this panel today is a culmination of the conversations that we've had over the past month, really centering around actionable steps that we can take as an AAPI community to be in solidarity with the Black Lives Matter and just Black racial justice movement in this country. So I wanted to start off by introducing our wonderful panelists today. So I'll start off by introducing Vanessa Carr. Vanessa is in the office of Governor Gavin Newsom. She is the Los Angeles Regional Coordinator for External Affairs. Growing up in an interracial family and among other communities of color, she found her passion on issues related to equity, social justice, and economic opportunity. Her dedication to community-driven leadership and advocacy has led to her work with organizations like Lead Filipino and elected officials like Representative Ro Khanna and Assemblyman Adri Nazarian. She is a Santa Clara University graduate, and she was born and raised in Silicon Valley, and she currently resides in the San Fernando Valley. Thank you, Vanessa, for joining us. Our next panelist is Christine Najung Lee. She is the Community Program Manager at Asian Pacific Community Fund, otherwise known as APCF, and she oversees the organization's API nonprofit sector capacity building programs, grants management, volunteer programs, as well as other resource development programs. And previously, she was the marketing manager with APCF, and she's also served at various Los Angeles-based organizations, including KYC, the Korean Youth and Community Center, or KYCC, excuse me, Little Tokyo Service Center, Asian and Pacific Islander Older Adults Task Force, at Nagasek, and a community health clinic in Koreatown. And she holds a master's in social welfare and a bachelor's degree in English and Asian American Studies from UCLA. Next is Elizabeth Hanna Rubio, who is a PhD candidate at UC Irvine and in anthropology. She's currently writing her dissertation on Korean American immigrant justice activists and how racialization impacts how they define immigrant liberation and navigate multiracial solidarity work. That sounds like very much a dissertation title. She's had her work published in Amerasia Journal, the LA Review of Books, and American Ethnologist. And she's also a fellow with the Center for Engaged Scholarship. And she's a New York City-born second-generation mixed-race Korean American and a former community organizer with undocumented communities in the DC metropolitan area, both my former hoods. And next we have Sarah Soluski, who is with OC Protest Community Coalition. She's the Media and Comms Director, the Communications Coordinator. She's a 23-year-old proud HBCU graduate from Tennessee State University with a bachelor's degree in Communication Studies with a concentration in mass communications and journalism. She's a self-proclaimed activist, coach, actress, and TV radio personality. And she's also accomplished an accomplished speech and debate coach for the Santa Ana Unified School District. Sarah is a proud Black queer woman of faith who is dedicated to fighting for justice for all oppressed peoples and will do so by any means necessary. Yes. And we have a surprise guest today, a new addition to our roster of amazing speakers. Her name is Natalie Martinez. Welcome, Natalie. She is with she's a student advocate at the Garden Grove Unified School District. And Natalie recently graduated from Garden Grove High School. Congratulations, Natalie. And is now enrolled at Cypress College. During her time at Garden Grove High School, she served as the secretary of the Black Student Union, the student group that organized the largest protest in Orange County, along with helping to lead various other protests. Their new forming group, Black Leaders of Orange County, is setting out to make ethnic studies a requirement in the Garden Grove Unified School District first, and hoping to expand the requirement throughout all of Orange County. So join me in welcoming this amazing all-star panel. I'm super excited about starting this discussion with all of you today. So I wanted to start this conversation off really grounded in your own stories and how it relates to sort of this overall goal that we've set out today about actual steps. So why is this conversation important to all of you? And I'll let whoever wants to go first start. No takers? You don't seem like a shy group.
Start.
Great.
I'll take the first stab. Hi everyone. I'm Vanessa Carr. You already heard a little bit of my bio and background, but why I, this particular moment, this movement really matters to me is I identify as Black and API. I am the proud daughter of an immigrant, a Filipino immigrant. And I am the proud daughter of a Black man, who grew up in Jackson, Mississippi, in the height of civil rights movement, and I have ancestors who were slaves. I have ancestors who were fighters in the Philippines, for racial and social justice. So this is incredibly personal for me. It's, as I said, I grew up in a very interracial household. My father's Black, my mother is Filipino, and that was very much formative in the way I grew up and the way I was raised. And that I was always raised to be, you are not one or the other. You are both. These are you have the dual identity, and of course being, adding that sort of Americanness too adds to that sort of dynamic about having these multiple identities, especially for mixed race. Those hyphenated identities, which can be really hard to navigate sometimes. And I know particularly anti-Blackness is very much a thing that exists in the API community. I've experienced it within, family members, friends, other POC communities. It's definitely not just within the API community. It does exist in other POC communities, and it's unfortunate that you have to sometimes prove yourself. That was something that I always struggled with growing up, especially because I don't necessarily look Filipino when you first look at me. I don't necessarily look like your typical, Asian American person, but I am, and I'm proud to be one. So it was very difficult, growing up in spaces, especially since I grew up in Silicon Valley, which, if you're familiar with, it's, beautifully diverse, but it's also an area that is has so many Asian American communities, and I largely grew up in that setting. So to sort of grow up in a space where you were usually the only Black face in the room, oftentimes in my classrooms, in my professional settings, it's hard. You can't help but feel othered, even though there's no intention for it. There's no necessarily bad intention behind it. You can't help but feel not welcome. It's a weird dynamic, but I'm very happy to see that these conversations are happening today. I mean, I've definitely had my fair share of uncomfortable conversations with folks in my immediate circle, my family and my friends, but I was also so encouraged by that. For me, it was a huge sigh of relief to hear those people that I consider very, very close in my close-knit circle reach out and ask how I was doing, reach out and almost sort of apologize for things that they have done to make me feel othered, to make me feel unwelcome in certain spaces, to talk about ways that they're going out there and going out on the streets and protesting and showing up for my community. And that was so impactful, especially last. I will say it was really hard the first couple of weeks, definitely, just to see everything happening and to have so much of an incoming in my own personal messages and texts. It was a lot, but it was really nice, incredibly encouraging, incredibly heartwarming, and happy to talk about that more, but I'll give the floor to someone else.
Hey, I'm like, oh, let me go next. I'm like, no one's unmuted.
Ooh.
Okay, cool. So it's me. Hey guys. So I've grown up in Orange County my entire life. I live in Westminster, Fountain Valley, like borderline city areas. Graduated from Fountain Valley High School. So I've been here pretty much my whole life until I went to Tennessee State University to go get my bachelor's degree, and then I've recently graduated. So now I'm back home. I've experienced a lot of racism in Orange County, a lot of anti-Blackness, just growing up. And so coming back home, especially from an HBCU, like leaving here and then going to an HBCU and then receiving the education that I did, even more, learning more about Black history and more about my ancestors and whatnot, and then really coming back and kind of being thrown into this movement and some things that, Vanessa had alluded to, being in this space and figuring out how to navigate your own personal feelings, and then, going along with how everybody else around you in your circle is reacting to this movement. I've found it necessary to be part of these conversations. And so it's really amazing that we're continuing to have forums like this. So those of us who have experienced the anti-Blackness, here in this area have a voice to express our concerns and what we've really been experiencing for a long time. And now we finally have a place to talk about those things. And I think for me, even more so, and really getting involved in this work, understanding that unity is the key to our liberation is why I'm here. Understanding that it's not going to take all Black people to come together in order to give us, proper liberation. It's going to take all oppressed and colonized people to come together and learn about each other and our histories and the injustices that we face in order to gain true liberation for all of us. So I think because I believe in unity being the key so much is a big part of the reason why I'm here, in order to engage in discussions that I think will propel us forward in this movement. So yeah, that's my spiel.
Thank you, Sarah. That was very powerful. Does anybody else, would anyone else like to? Liz?
Sure, I can go. So, I mean, I guess just like on the very personal level, I originally kind of came to these conversations out of the experience of, growing up with a first generation immigrant mom from South Korea in Harlem, and kind of seeing what those interactions were like every single day. But then more so kind of in my time as an organizer and now just working with organizers kind of all over OC, but then also kind of nationally, and kind of seeing the processes where, folks, especially AAPI folks, there's kind of a list of solidarity. There's like a solidarity repertoire that folks kind of know they're supposed to do, right? But when you actually get down to doing it, and this is what I'm writing ethnographic work on, it becomes much more complicated, right? And I think that we're at this moment, like, at the beginning of the pandemic, the author Arundhati Roy wrote, "The pandemic is a portal," right? And so we're kind of, I think this conversation is particularly important now because we're at this moment of such potential for social and political change. But while that's really exciting, it's also really frightening, because I think the confluence of COVID and this iteration of the movement for Black lives is kind of showing us that the tools and frameworks that we had before weren't really working. So it's pushing us into kind of a scary place, but that place is also a really exciting place to be. Because it's not easy to invent worlds that don't exist yet, right? So I just want to be putting in the work and paying my dues to kind of think through all of this together.
Good morning. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for having me. So I'm Christine Lee, and I was actually born and raised in Garden Grove, went to Pacifica High School. So I'm very glad to see that there's a recent graduate from Garden Grove Unified School District. And growing up in Garden Grove, the diversity in that area is kind of unusual, interesting, right? There's some diversity, certainly with Asian and Pacific Islanders and Latino communities, but not so much with African Americans. So the high school that I went to, unfortunately, you can count how many Black students there were on one hand. and you knew exactly who they were, what their names were, and they were all in choir with me. So that's the landscape that I grew up out of. But I'm also the child of Korean immigrants. I'm a second generation Korean American whose family arrived post Civil Rights Movement, post 1965. So for my parents and their generation, their education back in South Korea did not include race relations in the US. They did not learn about colonialism, about white supremacy. But when they came to this country, they had this ahistorical, apolitical view of how the races related to one another. And there is this default aspiration towards whiteness that while you're trying to achieve the American dream, especially as a small business owner, you're going to be working in predominantly Black and brown neighborhoods. So a lot of my family members are small business owners who worked in diverse neighborhoods, and this was all leading up to and during the 1992 civil unrest. So that was my childhood growing up, and that really what was a formation of my understanding of race relations. Growing up in this Orange County bubble until I went to UCLA and I started learning about ethnic studies. And so ethnic studies really became a part of my own awakening. My own racial consciousness began from there. So I'm a big proponent of ethnic studies, and I'm so excited that in my hometown that effort is being made now, because that was not even something we could have dreamt about back 20, 25 years ago when I was in junior high and high school, post 1992. So I'm very excited for this conversation. I think we need it. Our world is changing. Orange County, the demographics are changing. And frankly, as an Asian American, I'm sick and tired of minorities being pitted against one another. It happened back in 1992. It happened before that. It's been happening since then. And things, I'm hopeful that things can change, because what we've seen in the last couple of months is different. I think this pandemic, as painful and as much suffering as there has been, I think that a lot of people, especially the next generation, are rising up to meet this moment. So I'm very, very encouraged by what I'm seeing, especially with our young people. And as a mother now, for my own young children, that gives me a lot of encouragement and hope.
Really quick, because I know because of time. First off, thank you for having me. My name is Natalie. Why this conversation is so important to me, it hits home because where my parents are from, the Dominican Republic, it's a very anti-Black country. And the country itself is Black, so it's like, whoa, there's anti-Blackness in its own Black country. People don't realize that. And it affected me growing up here in the United States because I hated my Blackness. I hated myself overall until like my sophomore year in high school, where I started embracing it thanks to Black Student Union. And so anti-Blackness is like a really, really big issue, even just here in Orange County. Like Christine and Sarah said, we barely see any Black people here, and it's like, you can count them with your own hands because it's like barely any amount of people. So to me, it's very important, just building community, and like how Sarah said, like unity is the key. So if we're united, no one can stop us, right? We're going to be very unstoppable. So I think that's very important. Yeah.
Thank you all for all of those thoughtful remarks and perspectives. I wanted to, as somebody who runs a small nonprofit here in Southern California, I think one of the challenges that I have, but I know that other folks have in other capacities, is really building substantive collaborations with Black-led or racial justice organizations. So it's very easy to see somebody at a conference or a meeting and say, oh yeah, let's have lunch, when we could have lunch, and talk, but then you get caught up in your world and you sort of kind of put it to the side. So my question for you, and it kind of goes back to Elizabeth mentioned going into that scary place, but I think that there's a level of discomfort of going deeper, and we also have to be sort of ready to embrace that discomfort and be okay with all of what that brings. So my question for you is, how do we go past these superficial sort of collaborations and really go deep, and also sort of embrace this uncomfortable place that we might have to go into? Whoever wants to take it.
I got it. Okay, I was like, I think I hit it first. Okay, I think for me, the biggest thing is showing up, right? And so maybe you can't get that meeting going, but you can show up to a drive that an org is doing. You can show up to their political education seminar. So I really think starting to show up and just do the work will start to plant seeds and get those introductions going. And I think before you even start doing the work, it's about recognizing the orgs who are doing the work that you want to be involved in, right? So knowing your strengths, what you can bring to the table, and figuring out how best you can aid someone else in the efforts that they're already starting to do. So for example, there's a great organization called the People's Coalition. They've been doing a political education week on Black August. This entire week, they've just been getting on Zoom calls, such something like this, and we've been watching movies or listening to podcasts. They're also a really, really great organization that is involved in mutual aid programs, and in addition to that, political education, which is what they've been doing this week. And so they do a ton of drives. Right now, they've been building solidarity packs for the prisoners that are about to be released in Orange County. So showing up to, you know, their drop-off locations and donating and just introducing yourself to people, I feel like showing up is really where you can start making those awesome connections. And I know COVID is something that is everyone's comfortability level of going out is different, right? So, you know, you might not be comfortable going to protests or demonstrations, but if you can drop off something, that's awesome. Or like I said before, you know, showing up to seminars, it's really just being there. I don't think it has to be this really deep friendship or connection, but I mean, Natalie and I met at a protest, you know, so like, and now seeing her today in this seminar, like we have somewhat of a relationship to where we know who each other is just because I showed up and made sure like my support was recognized and was there just in case she ever needed it. So that's my little input on how to get involved here.
Yeah, I would echo those same sentiments, Sarah. I think wonderfully said. There are so many Black-led orgs and Black leaders who have been doing this work for decades. I'm based in Los Angeles, and we've got some great examples here. Community Coalition in South LA, Brotherhood Crusade, Inner City Struggle. These organizations have been doing this work, the hard and tough work for Black racial social justice for decades. So I don't think there's a need to reinvent the wheel. There are active programmings that are taking place within these orgs. There are different opportunities to participate in these orgs. And I also think it's really important to not take up space and to, you know, make sure that the ones leading this movement, you know, are the folks who are affected by this the most. I think it's really, really important to make sure that we're not changing things or trying to add things. Or if adding things, you know, when they're welcome, but making sure that, you know, this really stays Black-led, and that these folks that have been doing this work for decades continue to be, you know, have that voice in the spotlight. Sometimes that always worries me when I see social media and like different things in these other organizations and groups doing, you know, really great things and trying to be helpful to the movement. But I find it really problematic when there's no Black voices in those spaces. That's what's really important, and that should always be at the heart of it. If you're going to do something, make sure there are Black voices in those spaces. Make sure that there are Black people leading those spaces as well. Otherwise, it's just counterintuitive and it's not really helpful. It's kind of just like taking up space where you don't really need to take up space, because, you know, these groups have been doing it for a while. And that's something that I've been really trying to highlight with the work that I do with Lead Filipino, and we're trying to establish and, you know, be supportive of some of the Black-led organizations in the San Jose, Silicon Valley area a little bit more so. We've got some great ones. The African American Community Services Agency has existed for decades. They went from not having a physical space to now having this beautiful community center where they do so many types of community services, and they don't get highlighted enough. And our job be supportive and an ally in this movement, especially for the Lead Filipino group, is to support them, amplify them, give them space, give them spaces to talk about their work, support them where we can, and just be, you know, be an ally, not take over.
Yeah, and I think, you know, from the AAPI org perspective is that I think what often folks have to do is examine their own politics. Like, collaborations are always going to be flimsy if the politics that you advocate for are actively damaging the folks you want to be in collaboration with. So are you supporting politicians or policies or even ideas about the world that sustain the carceral state, right? That sustain the police state, right? So, you know, I've spent actually the last several months really dissecting a lot of these panels that have shown up since COVID and since George Floyd's murder. And unfortunately, what I saw a lot of AAPI orgs doing was saying, you know, in response to anti-Asian American hate crimes, is saying, report it to the police, right? We need to get those numbers so you can talk to lawmakers, so we can have purchase with lawmakers to talk about how racism against Asian Americans still exists. And it very much really does exist, right? But telling people to call the police is like, that's a non-starter for a collaboration, right? In this moment. You know, I see a lot of folks kind of uncritically celebrating Kamala Harris's nomination as the VP, as the first Asian American woman, as first Black woman on a major party ticket. Like, folks can be proud of what that represents, but when you go to these like really flimsy representational politics, like, yes, we can be happy that Kamala Harris is a VP pick, but if you do that independently of like what her actual record is in terms of Black folks and sustaining the carceral state, then so that like the first step is kind of examining those own politics. What allegiance do you have? What allegiances do you need to kind of not sustain anymore? Because that, and for me, that's the first step. That's the first step to anything else.
Thank you, Liz. Natalie.
So for me, I think reaching out to Black organizations goes a long way. Like letting them know, like, hey, if you need anything, I'm here for you, right? Or if you need any resources or any connections or this and that, I got you, you know what I mean? Just letting us know that we have someone to go to, right? Other than our own like core group goes a long way. And I would like to use an example of a beautiful group that I had the privilege to meet, which is VROC, Viet Rainbow of Orange County. Like, they have dedicated so much of their time to my group, or the former Black Student Union at Garden Grove High School. Emotional support, like anything that we needed, or, you know, physical, whatever it is, they were there to give it to us in any way or form that they can provide. And that just, it just like makes my heart overflow, because they have no obligation to do that, you know, and like nobody's telling them to do this, but they're doing it with all their love and heart. And it just shows that, okay, we're not alone in this fight. So yeah, shout out to them.
Thank you. Christine.
So there's not too much to add. I think my fellow panelists said all the major points. So I just want to add a couple things. First is ethnic studies. You know, we need to know our histories and how our communities have related to one another, how we work together, because that history is not being taught. And if we don't know where we come from and how we work together, as imperfect as it might be, like we don't know that, you know, Filipino workers, you know, were picking grapes alongside Mexican farm workers. We don't know that history. We don't know about the Third World Liberation Movement, you know, that happened in the 60s and 70s, where Black-led student organizations reached out to Asian American student organizations and said, hey, let's forge a path together. Let's work together towards making sure that all of our histories are told with the ethnic studies movement. And, you know, that a generation later, we're still fighting for it, because growing up in Orange County, I didn't learn that. I didn't know our history. I had to go to college and seek that history out. So if we don't even have that baseline of understanding of our communities and how we relate to one another and how we work with one another, we don't really have a kind of foundation to stand upon to address anti-Black racism within our own communities and showing up for our Black communities. So, and the other thing I want to add too is, I think Liz mentioned a really good point is, I do see a lot of AAPIs being galvanized during COVID-19 because of racism and discrimination that's been directed towards us. And I do want to say it's about time. I'm glad that people are, but let's not keep it self-contained. Let's not be inward about it. Let's be external about it and see that if we know our histories, we know that our communities have been pitted against one another and that there is this whole systemic racism that impacts our communities in different ways. So it impacts Asian and Pacific Islanders in this way. It affects the Latinx community in this way, LGBTQ in this way, and our Black communities in this way. And so we need to understand, that we can't have an expectation for other people to show up for the racism that we're experiencing unless we've shown up for them.
Great, thank you so much. There's so many thoughts coming into my head right now. One thing that I wanted to touch upon, and thank you, Liz, for bringing up Kamala Harris. I can't believe we're at 12:40 in this conversation, and hadn't, her name hadn't come up given this past week. One of the questions that I have in regards to her background, and some of you who identify as biracial and multiracial, may have more insight into this, but I often wonder whether she identified more with the Black community because of, and this isn't written anywhere, it's my conjecture, whether it was at least partially due to racism or alienation that her mother probably received from the Indian community, from the Indian American community, because we know, those of us who've grown up in that community know that that's very real. And it's easy to push people out who are biracial or multiracial, or make them feel othered. I think Vanessa brought that up at the beginning. So, one of the challenges for our community, for the Asian American community, is sort of this racism, and it's so deeply entrenched. And, Christine, as you were talking about your experience as a Korean American, it's so interesting because as an Indian American, colonization is very much part of our narrative. And for those of us who, have some basic knowledge of our history, the collaborations or the interchange of ideas between the Black racial justice movement and the independence movement in India are very much related. Yet, despite that racism still very much exists within our community. So my question for you is, how do we address that challenge? And not only amongst ourselves, like those of us who are part of the, quote unquote movement and are talking about this, but how do we make this into a really make this more inclusive, folks who don't have time to think critically about these issues? I think ethnic studies was, a good sort of action item that we need to take, is really encourage ethnic studies. But are there any other ways that we can really provide broad-based education and awareness to the AAPI community to really tackle this entrenched racism in a real way?
I'm sorry, was someone else about to go? Okay, sorry. I kind of want to, when you sent us this question, I kind of really wanted to address the kind of genre of Asian letters for Black lives. So this came up in the context, like kind of during the Ferguson uprisings, where young Asian Americans kind of said, we need language to talk to our older generations about anti-Blackness, right? And because, they migrated here, they don't necessarily have a lot of interactions with Black people in their daily lives. Many times they don't speak the language. So we want to develop a way to talk to them, right? And then this is seen of kind of resurgence within this moment as well, right? And I think it's important, oh my gosh, growing up, I would have loved to have that language and to have those materials to be able to talk to my parents about this, right? But at the same time, I think that's a really, really limited genre that's limited by a framework that kind of, makes it seem that anti-Blackness only lies within our parents' generation and not within ourselves. Like, I'm anti-Black, that's the nature of anti-Blackness, right? So by saying, oh, it's our parents' fault, it's we need to explain things to them, it's taking the burden off of ourselves. And I think that leads to kind of a second point, which is a framing of anti-Blackness that makes it seem like something you can just choose to not participate in, right? Or that something that can be reduced to kind of certain behaviors and utterances, and then it being anti-Black becomes around policing those behaviors and utterances, right? So it's more than kind of like knowing not to say the N-word, like, no, like, no, we shouldn't say the N-word, right? But it's also kind of redoing the work of rethinking how we actually relate to one another, and how we even, you know, in this moment, like how we define safety, right? And public safety, right? So it goes beyond this kind of work of like, this is how you behave, this is what you say and you don't say, or that anti-Blackness is something that is contained within these very limited kind of ideas, right? So yeah. So I think we need to move beyond. I think that the Asian for Black Lives genre is important, but I think we need to do more work.
Yeah, I think I would echo some of the similar sentiments that, you know, Liz had mentioned. That I think, I mean, obviously growing up API and Black myself, I think that work really needs to start inwardly before you start telling others and sort of educating others about anti-Blackness. Growing up in, you know, the Bay Area, there's, you know, a lot of API communities who think it's okay because they live in a certain area to say the N-word, to dress a certain way, to say, actually, I'm more Black than you are because I live in this area, or like, and that happened to me so much growing up, and continues to this day, people who think they can take away my Blackness because it's, which is ridiculous, because for me, I will always be more Black than anyone else. Because of the things I have to experience, because of those comments that, you know, friends of mine had made to me, people that I trusted had made to me, and it comes unknowingly a lot of the times. It does. I don't even think it comes from a place of malice. It's just so ingrained and institutionalized in the way we speak, the way we go about our daily lives. I mean, if you look I live in Los Angeles. It's one of the most diverse places in the world. It's also one of the most segregated places in the world. Our communities don't live amongst each other, especially in LA. You know, there are definitely parts of Los Angeles that are, you know, more Asian American, and others that are more Black or more Latino. It's very real. That's the reality. And pretty much every major city in the United States is that we don't live amongst each other. We don't learn from each other in ways that we should be intermingling and learning from each other. But I do think that work starts very much so inwardly. And you had, Shika, you had mentioned, you know, Kamala Harris's, you know, identity growing up. I struggled with that myself. What am I? Obviously, to folks in the API community, I was Black, and then to those in the Black community, actually, you're not Black enough. So that's an ongoing dynamic. I mean, I'm older now. I'm a 26-year-old woman. I'm proud to say that I am both. I am a Black Filipino American woman. So that's who I am. No one else can take that identity away from me. But I mean, it's also very telling of just the way we speak about folks and how ingrained anti-Blackness really is. And I'll go back to the example of Kamala. The way she's been criticized, you can tell that it's very deeply rooted in anti-Blackness. Very much so, and that's something you can't deny. And you know, some of the critiques to her career and her background, of course, is very fair, especially in her, you know, prosecution background. But it's also, there have been several other, you know, candidates who've run for office in the past who have, you know, the same backgrounds, but are not getting as, you know, didn't receive as much scrutiny as you know, Kamala's experiencing, you know, because she's a Black woman. I mean, that's the reality of being a Black person in this country, is that you are, and especially if you're a Black woman. I mean, it's Black, I come from, you know, a background in politics and government, and Black women are just so heavily scrutinized for everything. Oh, especially those comments about Kamala especially made me very upset when I was seeing headlines. She's too ambitious. She's too combative. You know, that whole angry Black woman narrative. It's absolutely ridiculous. It's so ingrained, and I don't even think people see how ingrained it is sometimes, the way we talk about people, the way we you know, criticize people. I mean, it's happened to me. I went to a predominantly white institution, Santa Clara University. There were so many times there where people, you know, questioned my place there, questioned how I got in. Oh, they're like, you definitely got in because you're Black, and there's not very many of you here. I mean, those comments happen all the time, and it's so ingrained, and it's, I don't even think there was any malice behind it. That's honestly just what they thought. but it's going to take work. It's not something that can be dismantled in a day. And like Liz said, it's not something you turn off. It's very much inherent in the way we speak and the way we act and the way we talk and the way who we interact with. It's going to take a lot of checking in on yourself and checking yourself as often as possible, really.
Thank you. So we are supposed to wrap up, but I really wanted to take at least one question from the audience. And this is a very sort of concrete question, so I think it'll be helpful to the participants. So the question is, as we approach Election Day, I've seen anti-Black comments from AAPI community regarding affirmative action, often with the model minority myth, American dream narrative, and colorblind racism. Do you have resource suggestions to educate ourselves and those around us? Any takers?
I'm trying to think specifics. I would know everyone kind of like did like the upward look, like, wait, what's like a specific thing I can cite really quick, but I don't have anything specific off the top of my head. However, if you visit ocprotest.org, we have an educational tab that has a bunch of articles that you can read, documentaries and whatnot that address like anti-Blackness in general, and just a lot of educational resources that are really helpful during this time that might lead you to something to answer your question. So ocprotest.org, in the educational tab that we have, there's just a bunch of resources that are already listed there that you can dive into and continue to look at.
Three kind of scholar activists that are doing really important work on that issue that folks can check out. The first is Vivian Shaw, who is at Harvard, and she, with her students, did something called the Harvard Syllabus, which is specifically putting together a syllabus to talk with AAPIs, especially, you know, the belly of the beast at Harvard, about affirmative action. So I think you can just Google Vivian Shaw Harvard Syllabus. Janelle Wong at UMaryland has done a lot of kind of the more empirical, like statistical work. And then Claire Jean Kim, who's at UCI, also, it's an intentionally provocative title that's kind of misleading, but the article is called "Are Asians the New Blacks?" She's not saying yes, but it's an interesting take from an Afro-pessimist perspective on affirmative action. So yeah, those three kind of folks are kind of pioneering that work right now in academia.
Great, thank you, Liz. And I did want to mention, I spoke just a couple of days ago on a panel about Proposition 16. Maybe somebody from the planning team can find the link to the website, but there's a great website about supporting Proposition 16, which seeks to repeal 209 and bring back affirmative action in the state of California. So again, I don't have the website with me, but I'll try to find it before the session is over. It has a lot of really great resources about, and it's, you know, specific to AAPI communities as well. My very last question for you, and I did want to remind our guests who are with us on Zoom that we will be having a sort of a breakout session from 1 to 1:30 to sort of dive deeper into these conversations that we're having. So if you are able to stay, that would be wonderful. I know that we're running a little late today. So my last question for you, again, and I know that, you know, we've just scratched the surface. We could be talking for hours. And as many of you have noted, this is not a one-off conversation. We're going to be having these conversations for many years to come, and they're not easy conversations to have. So my last question for you is really, what are some, you know, 1 or 2 actionable steps that the Asian American Pacific Islander community can do, can take, they can commit to taking now to, you know, address anti-Black racism in our community and support the fight for racial justice?
My first thing, like my biggest thing that I tell everyone is that we don't know enough. None of us do. Right? So none of us know enough, whether you're a part of the Black community or you're outside of it. And so everyone can't do everything, but everyone can do something. And so I think for me, the biggest thing is to commit to doing one thing every day that pushes us forward, right? That moves us a little bit closer to liberation. So, I mean, if you have money, put your money where your mouth is, you know, donate to mutual aid programs, or to bail funds, or visit your local Black business, you know, help uplift the Black community. And another separate thing that I think is really great is get involved in your board of supervisors meetings, or, you know, attend your city council meetings if you can. There's a lot that's going on that we can do right now that can affect us locally, that things that we can see in front of our face versus waiting for, you know, things like the presidential election and things that may not gain us the liberation that we want to see right now. So my biggest thing is commit to doing one thing every day, whether that's educating yourself or, you know, donating your money to or putting it back into the Black community.
So, you know, I come from a community fund, so we are a funder. So from the philanthropic standpoint, I definitely want to ring the bell on investing in Black-led and people of color-led organizations, because when you look at how government money and philanthropic money is spent, it's not equitable. And we're having these conversations now, but I feel like this conversation's been going on for a long time. And when it comes down to like communities of color, there is a sense that a mindset of scarcity, that we're all fighting for the same slice of the smallest slice of the pie, right? Rather than thinking of, well, what about the rest of the pie? Or can this pie get any bigger? We've got the ingredients, right? So when we're looking at like, you know, city or county budgets, or, you know, foundations, and, you know, and how they're divvying up their money, I really want us to be critical, rather than thinking this is the Asian money, this is the Black money, this is the Latinx money, this is the LGBTQ money. Let's get together and demand a bigger pie. APCF, we got started in 1990. We're celebrating our 30th anniversary because there was a lack of specific resources that were going to our communities. But our vision is that there may be a day where we're not needed anymore, where resources are distributed equitably. So that way we don't have to be like, you know, carving out specific API money for our API nonprofits. And I want to acknowledge that a lot of our Asian and Pacific Islander organizations are the ones that are doing the seen and unseen work of collaborating with other communities of color. I've worked in this sector my entire career, worked for many different Asian nonprofits, and they've all had a social justice lens, and they've all, you know, as naturally as breathing, they've always worked with, you know, other communities of color, whether it was around housing or fair wages or green space or environmental justice. They've always worked together. So for us, you know, one example of how we try to do this for APCF is we got started to do workplace giving because, quite frankly, United Way and other foundations were not distributing money to our communities. But we don't work in silos. When we do these workplace giving campaigns with public sector and private sector employees, we don't operate on our own. We do these campaigns in tandem and together with Brotherhood Crusade, with Community Health Council, with United Latinx Fund, with the organizations that represent the disabled community. So rather than saying like, hey, like I'm going to chase after the Asian employees and, you know, make sure to get funding for my organizations, we actually will present a united front to go in front of the Board of Supervisors to say, hey, give your blessing on this campaign so we can go out and talk to the county employees, and let's see if we could get a bigger pie for everyone. So rather than divvying it up and saying like, you know, it's just going to be my money that I'm fundraising, we always say, give to the campaign as in general. As a donor, you can choose who you want to invest in, but let's work together to make sure that we can all lift each other up.
And really quick, oh, sorry.
No, go ahead, Natalie.
Really quick, if you're able to run for office, do that. I really encourage that, because oftentimes we're saying vote, 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 but it's like, who do we vote for? You know, if it's the same people that are not helping us, right? So if you have I wouldn't say the platform, but just like the potential to, you know, to run for office, count on the community to vote for you. And yeah, I just want to encourage that.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, to build on what kind of Christine said, it's really important to actually give up material resources because, as virtue of being APIs, we have access to different pots of money that frankly Black folks don't, right? And that's a bigger structural issue. But even beyond that, like, I think there needs to be a lot of going back and examining, what do we actually mean by justice? And what do we actually, like, these really fundamental rethinking of things? Because a lot of the times what we think of as justice is actually damaging to other folks, right? So, like the movement for Black Lives, and I'm talking about like capital letters, like I don't know, I don't think they're technically an organization. They have 3 demands, right? So the first one is to defund the police. The second one is for Trump to resign. But the third one is to reinvest in the things that make Black communities whole. And that is, like abolition, people talk about abolition as if it were an act of destruction, but it's an act of creation, right? And that third part is the hardest part, is making what makes a community whole, right? And we all need to do that hard work. Like and it's important, again, like Black leadership, we need to be following Black leaders at this time. We need to be checking ourselves, et cetera. But that doesn't mean, and my first quarter as a grad student, Dr. Tiffany Willoughby Herard at UCI told me this, and this has stuck with me forever. She said, just because you're Black doesn't mean you don't have to do the work, right? Stepping back doesn't mean that you don't have to think with people, right? Even if you're not centering your own voice. We are all trying to figure out what a world without police and prisons look like, right? But we don't know what that looks like yet. So we all have to do that work. And that involves these really more fundamental conversations about what that looks like, because we don't know. Yeah, thank you.
Going off of all of that, I can't help but really encourage political agency. My background is in government, and obviously, I'm a civic engagement organizer on this side. So I wholeheartedly believe in the importance of voting and staying involved within the people who, we elect, and making sure that we hold them accountable for things. There are so many important, like, yes, we have a presidential election. That's not the only thing going to be on your ballot this November. There are several other races in your local communities that you all need to make sure you elect the right people to those seats. Your county board of supervisors, your local city council members, your mayors. If you have an upcoming mayoral race, you have, I think, I don't know, like 15 propositions that we're voting on. I can't remember. There's a lot that all have an effect. We have the schools and community first initiative that we get to vote on. We have a chance to allow former felons to vote again. Like, there are so many important propositions and initiatives and local bond measures. I'm sure it's that, invest money back into your local communities that we all have agency in, or at least some of us have the privilege, if you're a citizen of this country, to be able to vote and make sure that, we give our communities a fighting chance. And I mean, voting is just one step. Yes, we have an election, but political advocacy and engagement doesn't end after November 3rd. It's an ongoing fight. We have, your city councils meet all the time. They meet all the time. They have public comment all the time. Your board of supervisors, same thing. We have pretty important, because I work for the California, state of California, we have important bills making their way through the legislature, or have already. So many folks here have mentioned ethnic studies. AB 1460 is the ethnic studies bill proposed by Assembly Member Shirley Weber from San Diego. It already passed both houses, so it sits on the governor's desk. There are so many things here, so I'm sure there are so many groups represented here today. You could be organizing to make sure that bill gets signed. I know I work for the governor, but it's awkward, but it's fine. He knows where I stand on this. But I think it's really, really important that our communities know their history, and that our history is told to others, because it's important. But there are so many bills like that are working their way through the legislature, and they could use the help of everyone in this room to make sure that, they make it to the end, and that they actually get signed and passed. So that's where I'll leave it.
That was a perfect note to end on, Vanessa. Thank you so much. And thank you to all of you. A couple of things to go off of Vanessa's remarks. One even more immediate way that we can all work together is to make sure that every single one of us is counted in the census. As many of you know, the census has been unexpectedly cut short and is now ending on September 30th. So if you or anyone you know has not participated in the census, please, please, please go to the census website. And if there are language issues or just help, if anybody needs help figuring out how to fill out the form, many of our groups, all the collaborative partners have resources on how to do that. And then please register to vote. It is incredibly important to make our voices heard in November for all the reasons that Vanessa stated. And then the one other thing that I did want to just say, because we didn't have the time to go deep into this conversation because of time, but I just want to acknowledge Natalie's work as a young leader in our community, and that you in so many ways are our future, and that I hope that we see you on a ballot someday soon. So just wanted to acknowledge that and thank you for your work. So with that said, I'd like to pass the baton on and thank all of you. Thank you all for joining us today. I look forward to meeting all of you in person when this crazy pandemic is over, whenever that might be. And so now I'd like to pass this on to my colleague, Zainab Saida, who is SAN's Manager of Community Outreach, and she will introduce this final portion of today's event. And those of you on Facebook, I believe this ends this portion of the program, but if you have the Zoom link, please join us for the next 20 to 30 minutes. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. And thank you to the panelists. That was a very powerful conversation. And I think such a beautiful way to end off this series and to hopefully, start brewing a pot of what can come next to see what we can do and sort of inspire the remaining conversation. So I see a lot of familiar faces and some new faces from previous panels. And this last portion, we're really hoping to be more of a reflection space as we are coming to an end with this series. But of course, the work is just starting. The conversation has started, but that's not where it ends. Talking about it and doing something about it are two very different things. And so I wanted to, or we as a planning committee first wanted to say thank you to all of you for joining us. Thank you to the panelists for this panel and previous panels for joining us and being here with us over the past 5 Fridays. And yeah, so sort of to transition into our reflection space, we usually traditionally in the past, we've been breaking out into smaller groups, but because this is the final discussion and it'll be a more intimate conversation, we were hoping to do sort of a reflection space where if people feel comfortable sharing, they can. But for the next 2 minutes, let's take some time to really reflect on what we've learned in this session and in past sessions, and maybe jot down some notes on what we would like to commit to in combating anti-Blackness in the Asian American and larger communities. And also, if you are interested in jotting down some topics that you'd like to explore further, please do so as well. So we'll check back in at 1:10 and then we can share. Okay. I'll play some elevator music while we're waiting.
Can we give a round of applause to Shika for leading off such a wonderful panel? Yay! Just want to recognize her.
Thank you.